It was late October 2018. I was 27 at the time, living in Arizona, and I had been trying to get back into camping again after years of city life. I drove out one Friday morning to a quiet stretch of land near the edge of the Navajo Reservation, about a 2-hour drive from Flagstaff. The area was mostly flat desert scrub with a few clusters of twisted junipers and sandstone ridges. It was the kind of place where the silence felt heavy. I picked that spot because it was isolated, far away from the usual campsites. I wanted peace and quiet, no traffic, no people, no phone service, just space to breathe. I reached the place around noon, parked the truck near a dry creek bed, and started setting up camp. The air was dry and cool, the kind of weather that makes you think the night will drop cold. I pitched my small green tent facing the low ridge to the west, built a small ring of stones for a fire, and gathered some dead wood from the nearby brush. I had a cooler full of food, a camping chair, and my old hunting knife strapped to my belt. It all felt familiar, comforting even. By late afternoon, the sunlight turned golden over the sand and the wind picked up just enough to make the branches creak. I sat near the fire ring and listened to the desert sounds, the distant chirp of crickets, the faint rustle of dry grass. Nothing felt out of place. I remember thinking it was too quiet, but I shrugged it off. I had been living in noise for so long that silence felt strange. When the sun began to set, I lit the fire. The light flickered against the red rocks and my truck's metallic paint. I cooked a simple meal, some sausages and beans, and ate while watching the last bit of daylight fade. Once darkness settled in, the stars came out thick and sharp. Out there, away from the towns, the sky looked enormous. I could see the Milky Way stretching across like spilled powder. I stayed up a while, sipping a beer, staring at the flames. It must have been around 9 p.m. when I started hearing small noises out past the firelight. It wasn't unusual. Animals moved through the desert all the time. Rabbits, coyotes, sometimes deer. But this was different. It wasn't the light steps of an animal. It was a slow, uneven crunch on gravel, then a pause, then another crunch like someone taking slow steps. I turned my headlamp toward the direction of the sound, but the beam just showed brush and rocks. Nothing moved. The wind was still. I told myself it was probably a coyote, or even just the ground cooling and shifting. I tossed another piece of wood into the fire and sat closer to it. A few minutes later, I heard it again, this time from the opposite side of the camp. Slow steps, stopping every few seconds like whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be heard. I scanned the dark again with my light, moving the beam back and forth. For a second, I thought I saw something pale behind a cluster of trees. But when I focused, there was nothing, just the shadows moving with the firelight. I decided to get inside the tent. The fire was still burning low outside, and I zipped up the tent tight. I lay in my sleeping bag with the headlamp still on, trying to calm down. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The desert outside was quiet again, but that kind of quiet starts to feel wrong after a while, like the world is holding its breath. Sometime during the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know what time it was, but the fire had burned out and the air was freezing cold. The first thing I noticed was a faint sound, almost like breathing. It wasn't loud, but it was close. I held still, barely breathing myself, listening hard. The sound came from outside the tent, just a few feet away. A slow inhale, then an uneven exhale. It was too steady to be the wind. Then I heard the sound of something brushing lightly against the tent wall. A fingertip, or maybe claws, dragging slowly down the fabric. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't move. I didn't even dare to reach for my knife because any sound might give me away. The slow, dragging sound circled halfway around the tent, then stopped. I could hear faint footsteps again, crunching softly away into the distance until everything went quiet. I lay awake for hours after that, waiting for something else to happen. My body was tense the whole time. I think I finally drifted off close to dawn because the next thing I knew, the light was coming through the thin tent fabric. When I stepped out, the air was crisp and dry. Everything looked normal at first. Then I saw the footprints. They were all around the tent, bare footprints, human-like, but the toes were long and spread too wide. Some were fresh, pressed deep into the dust. They circled the tent, then led off toward the trees. My stomach tightened when I realized they weren't mine. I checked my truck, doors locked, everything untouched, but the sight of those tracks made my skin crawl. I should have packed up and left right then. But I told myself maybe someone had wandered through in the night. Maybe a drifter or some local out hunting. I didn't want to believe anything else. So I stayed another night, stupidly thinking daylight had cleared things up. That afternoon, I went for a walk along the ridge behind camp to clear my head. From the top, I could see miles of dry land stretching out, the occasional dirt road winding through it. When I looked back toward my campsite, I noticed something strange. Near my tent, something was lying on the ground, dark, long. It looked like a piece of wood at first, but when I got back down there, I saw it was a dead rabbit. Its body was twisted, like it had been dropped from a height. The skin around its face was peeled back. No blood, just that. I didn't eat that night. I sat in my truck with the doors locked, watching the last of the daylight fade away. I kept the fire small and close. Every sound made me tense up. Around midnight, I heard movement again. Faint, deliberate steps around the edge of the light. I raised the flashlight through the windshield, scanning the dark. For a split second, I caught something in the beam. A shape crouched low to the ground, maybe 30 feet away. It was thin, too thin to be a person. The head looked wrong, long and pale, with dark patches across it like mud. I blinked and it moved, fast. The light caught it for less than a second before it vanished behind a tree. The way it moved didn't look right. It wasn't running. It was crawling but upright at the same time, like something pretending to be human. That was enough. I grabbed my keys, started the truck, and floored it out of there. The tires kicked up dust and gravel as I tore down the dirt road. In the rearview mirror, for a moment, I saw something standing in the middle of the campfire's dying glow. Tall, thin, unmoving. Then the fire went out completely, and there was nothing but darkness. I drove for nearly an hour before I saw the first sign of a paved road. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station that opened early for truckers. I parked under the lights and just sat there, shaking. When I got out to check the truck, I noticed something smeared near the back bumper. Brownish handprints, dry and cracked, like they'd been made with dirt or blood. I washed them off right there with the windshield fluid and paper towels, then got back on the road. I haven't camped alone since that trip. I still don't know what I saw. I don't tell people it was anything supernatural because I don't believe in that. But I know what I saw wasn't normal. It looked human, but it moved wrong. It left tracks like feet, but not quite. Sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I think about that breathing sound outside the tent. That slow drag against the fabric. I remember how it paused, like it knew I was awake. I've gone back through that area once, during the day, just driving. I found the old trail that led toward my camp, but I didn't stop. There was a strange stillness to the place, like it hadn't changed at all. Maybe it was a man living out there, maybe something else. Whatever it was watching me that whole night, waiting just beyond the firelight. I can still feel that quiet out there, the kind that presses against you, heavy and wrong. And when I think about going camping again, that's what comes back first. Not the stars or the smell of smoke. Just the sound of footsteps circling the tent, and the feeling that something out there was pretending to be human long enough to get close. I went camping alone once in the summer of 2016, out in northern Montana, near a place called Miller's Ridge. I'd been looking forward to it for months. It was supposed to be a short weekend trip, just me, my gear, and a few quiet days away from the noise of work. I'd done solo camping before, but never in that area. I had heard it was beautiful. Rolling grasslands, tall pine forests, and a long river cutting through the valley. I packed everything carefully. Tent, knife, hatchet, some canned food, a small stove, and enough water to last me a few days. The drive took about 4 hours from my small apartment in Helena. I remember the road turning from smooth asphalt to cracked dirt as I got closer. The further I drove, the emptier it got. No houses, no other cars, just the wind pushing through the trees. I reached the ridge around 3 p.m. The spot I picked wasn't on any official campground. It was a small clearing beside the tree line, about half a mile from a narrow river. The air smelled sharp and clean, and for a while I felt at peace. I set up my tent, gathered some dry wood, and started a small fire before sunset. The light faded slowly, the sky turning orange, then purple, and then a heavy dark blue. I sat near the fire, ate a can of beans, and listened to the sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, and the soft rush of the river in the distance. When the fire started dying down, I laid back on my sleeping mat inside the tent, feeling the cold of the ground through the thin layer of fabric. The forest was quiet then, almost too quiet. I woke up sometime around midnight. I didn't know why at first. It wasn't a nightmare. It was something else, a feeling. I opened my eyes and waited, listening. The fire outside was almost dead, just faint orange coals glowing through the mesh window of the tent. Then I heard it, a sound, distant at first, coming from the direction of the river. It was a sharp, deliberate crack, like a branch snapping under a boot. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, maybe a deer, but then it came again. 2 cracks this time, then silence. I sat up slowly, my heart already pounding. I told myself it was nothing, maybe the wind, maybe a raccoon. But the air was completely still. No wind, no sounds except for my own heartbeat. I stayed still for a while, maybe 10 minutes, just staring at the dim outline of trees through the tent's thin fabric. I was wide awake now. I could feel sweat forming on the back of my neck even though the air was cold. Then I heard it again, this time closer. It wasn't just the sound of walking. It was careful, almost measured, like someone was taking their time not to make noise. That kind of pacing didn't fit an animal. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The forest looked normal. The coals from the fire barely lit a few feet around the campsite. Beyond that, everything was swallowed in darkness. I waited, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. I turned off the flashlight to let my eyes adjust, but after a few minutes, I caught something. A shadow or shape, about 30 feet away, between 2 tall pines. It wasn't moving, just standing there. I froze. My body locked up. Could have been a trick of the light, but I could swear it was shaped like a person. Tall, narrow shoulders, head tilted slightly forward. I blinked, and for a second, it seemed to shift slightly to the right, like it had stepped behind one of the trees. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loud. I waited maybe another 5 minutes, and when nothing else happened, I told myself it was my mind playing tricks. I zipped the tent back up, but I couldn't sleep after that. I must have dozed off sometime near dawn because when I woke again, the light was creeping through the trees. The fire was dead, and the air smelled damp. I stepped outside, still uneasy but trying to shake it off. I looked around the clearing. The first thing I noticed were the footprints. Not animal prints, boot prints. Human. They were faint, but I could see them in the soft dirt near the tree line. The tracks came from the forest, stopped maybe 10 feet from my tent, and then turned back toward the trees. I followed them a bit, just to make sure I wasn't seeing things. They led a few yards into the woods before fading into the grass. I packed up my stuff quickly that morning. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the thought of someone standing near my tent in the middle of the night made my stomach twist. Still, I didn't leave right away. I had planned 2 nights, and part of me didn't want to let fear ruin the trip. So I stayed one more night, but I moved my camp closer to the river, where the ground was sandier and more open. I figured I'd feel safer there. The second day passed quietly. I fished for a while, cooked what I caught, and tried to relax. But as the sun started going down, the same uneasiness crept back in. I built a bigger fire that night, higher and brighter than before. I sat close to it, facing the woods. The longer I sat there, the more I started to feel watched again. That same heavy, pressing silence came over everything. Even the insects had gone quiet. It was around 11 when I finally crawled into my tent. I left my flashlight and knife beside me this time. I didn't even try to sleep. I just listened. The river made a steady sound, but underneath that, I thought I could hear something faint, soft footsteps again. They came and went, moving slow, like someone circling the area. Then I heard something heavier, like a boot scraping against a rock. Close, too close. I aimed my flashlight toward the side of the tent and turned it on. Through the thin fabric, I saw a shadow move quickly, something tall passing by. My heart jumped into my throat. I didn't think. I grabbed the knife, unzipped the tent, and stepped out, light shaking in my hand. The forest was empty again, silent. But the footprints were there this time, fresh, pressed deep into the sand, leading from the trees to the back of my tent and then off toward the ridge. That was enough. I threw my gear into the truck and didn't even bother folding the tent. I just drove, headlights cutting through the dark, hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles hurt. The road back to town was narrow, twisting, and I didn't stop until I saw lights again. When I got home, I checked the local news, half expecting to see something about a missing person or hiker out there, but there was nothing. A few days later, I talked to a guy at an outdoor supply store who knew the area. He said that spot near Miller's Ridge had been used years ago by hunters and that people sometimes still camped there even though it wasn't an official site. He mentioned that there'd been reports of squatters or drifters living out in those woods. I didn't go back to find out who it was. I still think about those footprints sometimes, how they stopped just 10 feet from my tent, how whoever it was didn't try to rob me, didn't try to talk, just stood there, watching, waiting. Since then, I've gone camping a few more times, but never alone and never anywhere near Miller's Ridge. Even now, years later, when I wake up in the middle of the night to a strange sound outside my window, that same cold feeling hits me again. The same one I felt that night in the woods, when someone somewhere in the dark was standing just far enough away to see me, but close enough that I could hear them breathe. It was a Friday night in late October, the kind of evening that promised rain and a heavy chill. But my friends and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We were staying at a remote site near Cedar Ridge, an area that was known for its quiet, dense forests. It wasn't far from a small town, but far enough to make you feel like you were in the middle of nowhere. No cell service, no distractions, just the woods, the fire, and the sky. We arrived at the site late, after dark, already feeling the threat of rain hanging in the air. The sky was overcast, dark clouds swirling ominously, but we figured we'd make it work. I was 23 at the time, and I'd been on enough camping trips to know that bad weather wasn't a big deal, as long as you prepared. So we set up camp quickly, the sound of our rain gear rustling and the clinking of metal poles as we assembled the tents in the dim light of flashlights. By the time we had everything set up, the first few drops began to fall. We huddled around a fire pit we had managed to dig out earlier, the crackling fire providing a small bubble of warmth against the growing chill. The rain started lightly at first, just a drizzle, but within an hour it had picked up. It became a steady, rhythmic downpour. At first, it didn't bother us much. We were drinking beers, telling stories, and just enjoying the quiet of the woods. The sounds of the rain on the leaves above us were almost soothing, a constant backdrop to our chatter. The fire crackled and popped, its light reflecting off the raindrops as they hit the ground. But as the night wore on, the rain only got heavier. We had to move closer to the fire, the wet air now thick with moisture, the scent of damp earth rising up around us. By 11 p.m., the wind started picking up. It was enough to make the trees sway, and every now and then, a branch would creak under the pressure, sounding like it was about to snap. That's when things started to feel off. Not terrifying, but there was an undeniable shift. The woods were too quiet. The rain, which had been a constant drumbeat, seemed to dampen even the usual sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves, the chatter of small animals. It felt as though the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to brush it off. After all, it was just a storm. My friend Eric, who was sitting next to me, pointed out that the rain seemed to be coming in waves, sometimes heavy, then lighter, but never letting up completely. We'd been sitting by the fire for hours, and I was starting to feel antsy. The damp air had seeped into my clothes, making me feel cold all the way through. I stood up to stretch my legs and wandered a little further from the fire, trying to get some space. The rain was coming down harder now, so I pulled the hood of my jacket tight around my head and tucked my hands into my pockets. That's when I heard it. It was a snap of a twig. I froze. The sound wasn't right, too deliberate. It was too loud for an animal. My first thought was that someone was nearby, maybe another camper, though I hadn't heard any voices or seen any signs of other people around since we arrived. I turned to look back at the fire, but my friends were all laughing, completely oblivious to the sound. I took a few steps toward where the sound had come from, my boots squelching in the wet earth. It was coming from the treeline, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Another snap, then a soft rustling. It wasn't an animal, that much was certain. It sounded like someone was walking through the woods, trying to be quiet, but not doing a very good job of it. I waited for a moment, my heart starting to race. Maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just a raccoon or a deer, but my gut told me otherwise. There was something wrong about it. The air felt heavier now, more oppressive. I turned to head back to the fire, but I stopped. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It wasn't a sudden, overwhelming fear, but a creeping sensation that grew with each passing moment. I took a few steps toward the others, but I stopped again, frozen in place. A figure, a shadow. It was standing just inside the tree line, barely visible through the curtain of rain. A tall silhouette, unmoving. I blinked a few times, but the figure didn't shift or change. It was as though it was waiting for me to move, waiting for me to make the first move. I backed up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know if it was a person or something else, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I turned and hurried back to the campfire, trying to keep my composure. When I reached the fire, my friends were still laughing, unaware of what had just happened. I didn't say anything right away. I just stood there, staring into the fire. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I just imagined the whole thing. But that didn't explain the feeling of being watched. And that didn't explain the fact that I had seen someone, standing there in the rain just out of reach of the light. It wasn't until we were all huddled inside the tents for the night that things started to get even stranger. The wind had died down, and the rain was now a steady drizzle. I tried to sleep, but the unease gnawed at me. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something outside, a movement, a rustle in the bushes. But each time I convinced myself it was just the storm, pushing branches around in the wind. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a loud noise, A bang, like something heavy had hit the side of my tent. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding. The others were awake now, too, and we all looked at each other, confused and scared. There were no more sounds, but the feeling of something being out there, waiting, lingered. We waited for what felt like forever, and just as I was about to crawl back into my sleeping bag, the sound came again, this time louder. A scraping like nails dragging across the tent. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent, and the cold air rushed in, making me shiver. I stepped outside cautiously, my eyes scanning the area around our camp. The rain had lightened again, and the moon was just barely visible through the clouds. There was nothing, but then I noticed something. The ground was disturbed. The soft earth near the edge of the camp was torn up, like someone had been pacing around the tent, close enough to leave a trail. There were fresh footprints in the mud. They were too large to be from any animal, and they seemed to circle around our tents. That's when we packed up. No more jokes, no more ignoring the feeling. We didn't even bother to try and wait for daylight. We were out of there by dawn, driving back to town, silent and shaken. I never found out who or what was out there in the woods that night. We never saw anyone, and when we told the locals about our experience, they just shrugged. But the next time I went camping, I made sure to check the woods around the camp before we set up, and I kept my eye on the shadows just in case. It was the summer of 2019, and I was 31 years old when I decided to take a solo camping trip through the south of France. I had been driving for a few weeks, sleeping in small campsites and sometimes just pulling over near lakes or forest areas when I found a quiet place. That night, I stopped somewhere between Millau and the Cévennes National Park. The area was full of pine trees, rolling hills, and small gravel roads that seemed to lead nowhere. It was late evening when I found a small clearing just off a narrow dirt road. It looked perfect, secluded, peaceful, and quiet enough to hear every sound around. The air was warm but not humid. The sky had that deep orange and purple glow that always comes right before darkness falls. I parked my small rental car near a few trees and started setting up my tent. There was no one else around. The nearest sign of life had been a small farmhouse about 10 minutes back, but even that looked empty. The forest here felt old, heavy with stillness. Once my tent was up, I gathered some firewood from the ground. Everything was dry, and the fire started easily. I cooked a small meal, just some canned beans, bread, and a bit of cheese I had bought earlier in a village. The sound of crackling fire mixed with the faint noises of insects, and I could hear the occasional rustling in the trees, probably just animals. For a while, I felt calm. I remember thinking that this was exactly what I had wanted, to be far away from people with no sound of traffic, no lights, no distractions. After I ate, I sat on a folding chair, staring into the fire. It was dark now. The forest around me was pitch black except for the glow of the flames. The silence had a strange weight to it. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt like the kind of silence that listens back. Every few minutes, I would hear small twigs breaking somewhere in the distance, maybe from deer or foxes. But one sound caught my attention. It wasn't random. It was a slow, steady crunching of gravel, like footsteps. I turned off my small flashlight to let my eyes adjust to the dark. The sound had come from the road I had driven in on, maybe 50 meters away. I waited. The forest was quiet again. Then the sound started again, slow, deliberate steps on gravel. I felt that tight feeling in my stomach, the one that makes your body freeze before your mind decides what to do. I told myself it was probably someone walking their dog or maybe another camper looking for a spot. But I hadn't seen another car or even tire marks on that road. Still, I tried to brush it off. I tossed another piece of wood into the fire and tried to act normal, even though I was starting to feel uneasy. A few minutes passed. The sound stopped. Then I thought I saw something, a shape between the trees. It was faint, but it looked like a person standing still. The firelight flickered, and it was hard to tell if my eyes were just adjusting weirdly. But I was sure something was there. My heart started pounding, that deep pulse you feel in your chest when you're trying to stay calm but your body already knows something's wrong. I stood up slowly and moved closer to the fire. The warmth of it made me feel slightly safer, like the light was a barrier. I kept staring into the trees, waiting for any movement. For maybe a full minute, nothing happened. Then, without sound, I saw the shape move. It wasn't walking normally. It was gliding behind the tree trunks, stepping carefully, almost as if trying not to make noise. That was the moment I realized this wasn't some random hiker. I reached for the flashlight and aimed it toward the area where I saw him. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on a man standing about 30 meters away. He was tall, maybe in his 40s, wearing what looked like an old, dirty beige jacket. His hair was long and messy, hanging down over his face. He didn't move when the light hit him, just stood there, staring. The way he was positioned was strange too. He wasn't facing me directly, but slightly to the side, like he had been caught mid-step. My throat went dry. I didn't say anything. I just held the flashlight steady, waiting for him to do something. After a few seconds, he slowly stepped back behind a tree, out of the beam. I lowered the light for a second, and when I pointed it back, he was gone. That's when panic really started to set in. I walked to my car, trying to act like I wasn't scared, but my hands were shaking. I double-checked that the doors were unlocked and that the keys were in my pocket. I turned off the flashlight again, crouched down near the tent, and listened. Every tiny noise now sounded amplified. The distant hoot of an owl, branches creaking, the faint whisper of the wind. But somewhere among those sounds, I could hear faint, slow movement again. It circled the camp. I could hear it, leaves crunching lightly, then stopping. Then again from another direction. I couldn't see anything past the firelight, but I knew someone was out there, watching me. I didn't want to run to the car too early, in case whoever it was tried to follow or block me. So I waited, crouched low behind my tent, barely breathing. The air felt thick. My ears were ringing from how hard my heart was pounding. Then I heard something that made every muscle in my body lock up. The sound of fabric rustling, someone touching the side of my tent. It was soft, slow, like a hand brushing against it. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew they were right there. I stood up fast and grabbed my flashlight again, pointing it toward the tent. The side was slightly dented, like someone's hand had pressed against it. I didn't think anymore. I sprinted straight for the car, yanked the door open, and slammed it shut. I locked all the doors and turned on the headlights. The beam illuminated the trees, the tent, the fire still burning. For a moment, nothing. Then, on the edge of the light, I saw him again, standing half-hidden behind a pine tree, facing the car. His clothes looked torn, his face pale in the light. He wasn't moving, just staring. I started the engine and reversed fast, the gravel crunching loudly under the tires. As I turned back onto the road, I looked in the rearview mirror. The man was standing in the open now, fully visible, watching the car as I drove away. His head turned slowly as I passed. I drove for almost an hour, not even knowing where I was going. Every shadow on the road looked like a person. When I finally reached a small village, I parked near a closed bakery and just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, breathing hard. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went back to the campsite with 2 police officers from the local station. My tent was still there, the fire had burned out, and nothing looked stolen or damaged. But there were footprints around the tent, fresh ones, deep in the dirt, circling the camp several times. They led into the forest and disappeared. The police said it was probably some drifter or someone living rough in the woods. They told me it happens sometimes that people pass through scavenging food or watching campsites at night. They didn't find anyone. I never camped alone again after that. Every time I think about it, what gets me the most is how silent he was. How long he must have been watching me before I noticed. The way he didn't say anything, didn't run, didn't even react to the light, just stood there, staring, as if waiting for something. Sometimes, when I drive alone at night, I still catch myself checking the mirrors too often, half expecting to see that same pale face in the headlights. I never did see him again, but that feeling, the one where the woods stop feeling empty and start feeling like they're holding their breath, never really left me. It was late October 2018, somewhere deep in the northern forests of Montana, not far from Glacier National Park. I was 34 at the time, and I had gone out for a solo hunting trip, a weekend I'd been planning for weeks. I had a small campsite set up about 2 miles off a dirt road near a slow, cold stream. It was quiet, remote, and the air smelled like pine and wet soil. I had my rifle, a small tent, some canned food, and enough gear to last 3 days. I remember the first night being calm, the kind of calm that feels heavy, like the whole forest is holding its breath. I had hiked all day before setting up camp, following animal trails, looking for signs of elk. I saw a few tracks, but nothing fresh. By sunset, I was tired and decided to settle in. The air dropped quickly, colder than I expected. I built a small fire, cooked a can of beans, and sat there watching the orange glow flicker against the trees. The sound of the crackling fire mixed with the stream nearby. I felt content, alone but content. That night I slept lightly. The ground was hard and uneven. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up to a faint noise, something moving outside. I froze, listening. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like slow, cautious footsteps, moving through the leaves. My first thought was that it might be a deer, but the steps were too careful, too slow. Then they stopped. Everything went silent again. I waited, not breathing, hand on my rifle. After a few minutes, I heard nothing else. So I convinced myself it was just a raccoon or something and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside the tent and immediately saw something strange. Around the edges of my campfire were boot prints. Not mine. These ones were bigger, wider, and looked like they'd been made recently. The ground was still slightly damp from the night, and I could see where whoever it was had stepped near my tent, maybe 5 or 6 feet away. I felt a sharp unease in my stomach. I was sure I hadn't seen anyone around the area the day before. I'd parked my truck at a small clearing by the old dirt road, and the trail I took wasn't one most hunters used anymore. I checked my gear. Everything was still there. Nothing stolen. Nothing moved except maybe my camp chair, which had been knocked slightly to the side. I told myself it was probably another hunter passing by, maybe checking the area in the dark and leaving. But the prints looked deliberate, like the person had stopped and stood there for a while, facing my tent. That part bothered me the most. I decided to go hunt anyway to clear my head. I packed up my rifle, a small pack, and headed deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser the further I went, the ground covered in thick layers of fallen pine needles. I followed a small animal path uphill until I reached a rocky ridge that overlooked a stretch of forest. I stayed there most of the afternoon, scanning for movement. Nothing. No elk, no deer, not even a bird for hours. The silence in that forest didn't feel right. By the time I got back to camp, it was late afternoon. The light was fading fast, the kind of pale gray that comes before dusk. I gathered some wood for the fire and started cooking. The quietness around me made every sound sharper. The crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, even my own breathing. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After dark, I sat by the fire with my rifle across my lap. I didn't hear anything for a long while, just the fire snapping and the wind moving through the trees. But then, faintly, I caught something again. It was that same slow sound of movement, off in the distance but not too far. The same careful steps, pausing between each one. It wasn't an animal. I know how deer or elk move. They're lighter on their feet, more rhythmic. This was heavier, human. I turned off my headlamp and let my eyes adjust to the dark. The fire was still burning low, throwing just enough light to see the edge of my camp. The sound came again, this time closer, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. Then it stopped. I waited. I could feel my pulse in my neck. Every muscle in my body was locked. Minutes passed. The forest was dead silent. Finally, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shape between two trees, just a faint outline. It looked like someone standing there, still as stone, facing my camp. I couldn't see a face or details, just the shape of a tall person, motionless. My throat went dry. I kept the rifle pointed in that direction, finger on the trigger guard, not moving an inch. After what felt like forever, the shape slowly stepped back into the darkness and disappeared. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up until dawn, sitting against a tree with my rifle ready, the fire out. When the sun came up, I packed everything as fast as I could. My nerves were shot. I wanted to get out of there. But before leaving, I decided to check where I'd seen the figure. I walked toward the trees, looking for any sign. And there they were, footprints again. Same size, same pattern as before. They circled the area around my camp, looping back toward the ridge. Whoever it was had been there for a while, close enough to see everything I did. I followed the tracks a little further, maybe 100 yards, until they split off toward the thicker part of the woods. That's when I saw something that stopped me cold. Hanging from a low branch was a piece of torn fabric, dark green, almost the same color as my tent. It looked like part of a jacket sleeve, frayed at the edges, caught on the branch. Below it, the ground was disturbed, like someone had been crouching there. I left it there and walked back fast, checking behind me every few seconds. The forest suddenly felt alive again, but not in a good way. It was like every sound carried weight. I couldn't tell if I was being followed or if my mind was playing tricks, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. By the time I reached my truck, I was sweating despite the cold. I threw my gear in the back and started the engine immediately. The road out was rough, the kind of dirt path that winds endlessly through trees before you hit any sign of civilization. About halfway out, I saw something ahead in the road. I slowed down. It was a small wooden sign nailed to a tree. Someone had painted over it in red letters, "Private land, keep out." The thing is, that sign wasn't there when I came in 2 days before. When I finally made it back to the highway, I stopped at a gas station about 20 miles out. There was a map pinned to the wall by the counter. I looked closely at it, trying to see where exactly I'd been. My stomach dropped when I realized the spot I'd camped in wasn't part of the public hunting land. It was a section of private property, cut off years ago, owned by some old rancher who died long back. Locals said the land was left untouched since then. I sat in my truck for a long time after that, thinking about those footprints. Whoever had been there that night wasn't some random camper. They knew I wasn't supposed to be there. Maybe they lived out there. Maybe they watched anyone who came too close. I never went back. I still hunt, but never alone anymore. And every time I see a boot print in the mud that doesn't match mine, I remember that forest in Montana. The quiet, the dark, and that figure standing still among the trees, waiting just out of the firelight. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up at night thinking I hear those same slow, careful steps outside my window. It was late August of 2012 when I decided to go camping on my uncle's old farm in southern Missouri. He hadn't used the land for years, ever since he sold most of his cattle and moved to the city. I had a week off from work and wanted peace and quiet. No phones, no noise, just open land and sky. The farm sat about 2 miles off a county road, surrounded by tall, uncut grass and broken fences that looked like they were barely holding together. I drove down there on a Friday afternoon in my old pickup truck. The air was hot, the kind of sticky heat that sits heavy on your skin, but the wide fields and smell of dirt felt good. I parked near the edge of a line of trees, a few hundred feet from an old red barn that had half its roof caved in. The land stretched far in every direction, just endless golden weeds swaying under the sun. I set up my tent near the treeline, close enough for shade but far enough from the barn that I wouldn't smell the damp wood. I brought a cooler, a small propane stove, and a folding chair. I planned to stay 2 nights, Friday and Saturday, and leave Sunday morning. I wanted to watch the stars, maybe take a few photos, maybe just sit and think. By the time the sun started dipping behind the hills, I had already eaten a can of chili and a sandwich. The air cooled down, and crickets started their steady noise. It was peaceful in a strange way, almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel bigger than it should be. Around 9:30, I noticed something odd. The barn door was swaying slightly. It wasn't windy, not even a little. I could hear the hinges creak now and then. I figured it might be a raccoon or maybe just the wood shifting from age. I didn't think much of it. I sat by the fire until around 11, then crawled into my tent. The fabric walls felt thin, but I was tired. I fell asleep quickly but woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of movement outside. It wasn't the normal kind of sound like a small animal scurrying. It was heavier, slow steps through the grass. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but the sound stopped and started again in a strange pattern like whoever or whatever it was trying not to make noise. My heart started beating fast, and I just lay there, listening. The steps moved closer, then stopped completely. I waited, holding my breath. A minute passed, maybe 2. Then I heard something metallic, a light clink, like something brushing against the side of my cooler. I had a hunting knife with me, nothing big, but enough to make me feel a little better. I gripped it and waited, not daring to move. The sounds faded after a while, and I told myself it was probably a coyote sniffing around for food. Still, I didn't sleep much after that. When morning came, I stepped out and looked around. The grass was wet with dew, and the cooler had been knocked on its side. The lid was open, and one of the sandwich wrappers was gone. There were no clear footprints, just flattened grass. But I noticed something strange about 50 feet away, a small trail leading toward the barn. I walked over, trying to shake off the unease, and saw where the grass had been pressed down, like someone had walked through it more than once. It didn't look like animal tracks. The path led straight to the side of the barn where an old wooden door hung crooked. I peeked inside. The air inside was stale and smelled of mold and hay. Dust floated in the light that slipped through the holes in the roof. The barn was mostly empty except for a few rusted tools, a broken tractor seat, and piles of wood. But at the far end, I saw something that didn't belong there. Fresh footprints in the dirt. Bootprints. They led to a dark corner where some old sacks were stacked. I froze, staring. The prints looked new, maybe from last night. My stomach dropped. There was no sign of anyone, but I didn't stay to look any longer. I stepped back, careful not to make noise, and returned to my camp. The rest of that morning, I tried to keep busy. Boiled some coffee, walked around the field, took a few photos. But the whole time I felt like someone was watching me. Couldn't shake it. The feeling sat heavy in my chest. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it felt stupid to run from nothing. That afternoon, I noticed something else. Up near the treeline on the far side of the field, maybe 200 yards away, There was an old shed I hadn't seen before. The roof had partly collapsed, but it looked like there was a small path leading to it through the tall weeds. I figured I'd check it out later before sunset. When I finally walked over there, the sun was low, the sky orange and purple. The shed looked worse up close. Holes in the walls, splinters sticking out everywhere, and the faint smell of old manure. I pushed open what was left of the door, and my stomach turned a little. Inside were old farming tools, ropes, and buckets, but there were also newer things. A few beer cans, a torn sleeping bag, and a dirty blanket laid out in one corner. Someone had been sleeping there recently. That's when it hit me that maybe I wasn't alone out here. Maybe some drifter or squatter had been staying on my uncle's land. Maybe that's who had been near my tent last night. My mouth went dry thinking about it. I backed away slowly, then turned and walked fast toward my camp. As I walked, I felt eyes on me again. The hair on my neck stood up. I turned once but saw nothing except the tall weeds moving in the wind. Back at camp, I decided I wasn't staying another night. I started packing up right away. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and shadows stretched long across the fields. I was almost done loading my things when I heard movement again, the sound of grass being pushed down, quick steps this time, moving fast from the direction of the shed. My hands shook as I grabbed the rest of my gear and threw it into the truck bed. I didn't look back. I slammed the door shut, started the engine, and sped down the dirt road. In my rearview mirror, I saw a figure standing near the edge of the trees, just standing there, half hidden in the shadows. I didn't stop until I reached the county road. I sat there for a few minutes, breathing hard, trying to calm down. The night was quiet again, but it didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt wrong. When I got back to town, I called my uncle the next day and told him what I'd seen. He said no one had permission to be out there and that a few of his neighbors had reported seeing strange people camping near the abandoned properties around that area lately. He said sometimes people used those old barns to hide out for a while, especially when they were running from something. That thought stuck with me. Whoever was out there that night, whoever had been watching, was probably still somewhere out in those fields, living quietly in the forgotten corners of land no one visits anymore. It's been years since then, but I still remember how it felt to stand in that open field, realizing I wasn't as alone as I thought. I've camped in plenty of places since, but never again near an abandoned farm. There's something about old land like that. Too much space, too much quiet, and too many places for someone to hide. Sometimes when I think about that night, I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed just one more night. If I hadn't woken up, or if I had decided to look outside my tent when I heard the noise. The thought makes my chest tighten even now. I still keep that old hunting knife in my truck. Not because I expect trouble, but because I know now how fast a quiet night in the country can turn into something else. I decided to camp alone that summer in 2014. I was 27, living in Ohio, and working long hours at a warehouse job that had started to grind me down. I wanted quiet. I wanted to disappear from screens, people, and noise for a while. I packed up my old Ford Ranger with a tent, a sleeping bag, a cooler full of food, a fishing rod, and a little gas stove. My plan was to drive south into Kentucky, find some quiet patch of forest near the Daniel Boone National Forest, and stay for a few nights by a creek. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just said I'd be gone for a few days. The drive took about 5 hours. I left around noon, stopped for gas twice, and got there around evening. The dirt road leading into the area was barely visible, just a thin, dusty trail cutting through the trees. I followed it until I found a flat clearing beside a small creek. There was no one around, not a single car, not even a power line in sight. Perfect. The first night was calm. I set up my tent facing the creek, built a small fire, and cooked some canned chili. The air smelled like pine and damp leaves. The sound of crickets filled the darkness. When I lay down in my sleeping bag, I felt that quiet emptiness that city people crave. The kind that's so deep it makes you notice your heartbeat. I woke once during the night to what I thought was an animal rustling through the brush, probably a raccoon or deer. I didn't bother checking. I just listened until it stopped and fell back asleep. The second day, I hiked about 2 miles upstream with my fishing rod. The creek twisted between smooth rocks and fallen trees. The sun came through the canopy in thin golden strips. I caught a few small trout, enough for dinner. Around late afternoon, I headed back to camp. As I got close, something looked off. My tent flap was open. I was sure I had zipped it up when I left. I stopped, staring for a long moment, trying to figure out if I was remembering wrong. My cooler was still beside the fire pit. The chair was where I'd left it. I went closer. My backpack was lying on its side, and the top pocket was unzipped. Inside, some things were shifted around. A flashlight missing, one of my socks gone, a pack of beef jerky half open. No sign of any animal tearing at it, just like someone had unzipped and gone through it carefully. That made me uneasy. I looked around, scanning the trees, the creek, the slope behind my camp. Everything was still. I tried to tell myself maybe I left it open, maybe the wind blew it. I didn't want to overthink it. I stayed one more night. That night, I didn't sleep well. The forest was louder. The wind creaked through branches. Frogs croaked by the creek. Something snapped twigs far off in the dark. I kept my flashlight in my hand under the blanket. Every little sound felt closer. I told myself it was just my nerves. But once, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard what sounded like footsteps. Not animal steps, slower, spaced apart, steady. Crunching on dry leaves, stopping, then starting again. I froze, holding my breath. The steps stopped somewhere near the creek. Then I heard a splash of water, like someone stepping through it. I waited a long time after that, maybe an hour, before I managed to close my eyes. The next morning, I decided to leave. I didn't want to admit to myself that I was scared, but I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting someone to appear. When I packed up, I noticed something new. The small pile of rocks I had made near the fire pit. I used them to hold my pan steady, had been rearranged. They were now stacked into a small, neat tower, like someone had done it deliberately. I didn't do that. That was enough for me. I threw my stuff into the truck and drove down the dirt trail until it hit the main road. I told myself I'd get a cheap motel for the night and drive home in the morning. I found a small town called McKee about 40 minutes away and rented a room in a rundown roadside motel. That night, around 9, I was sitting on the bed eating gas station food, scrolling through my phone. Then I heard it, a knock. Not on the door, but on the window. 3 short taps. I froze. The blinds were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a shape standing just outside, blocking the light from the parking lot lamp. I didn't move for a few seconds. Then I stood up and went to the door, locked it tight, and turned off the room light. I waited by the peephole, but whoever it was standing just beyond its view. I could only see the side of a shoulder, maybe a dark jacket. Another knock, softer this time. Then nothing. I stood there, barely breathing, listening. The sound of a car passed by on the highway. The shape outside didn't move for a long time, maybe a minute or more. Then I heard footsteps walking away on the gravel. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the door with the lights off, waiting until dawn. When sunlight finally came through the blinds, I went outside. There were footprints in the dirt below the window. Big ones, boots by the look of them. I packed up again. Didn't even bother checking out at the front desk. I drove straight back to Ohio, barely stopping except for gas. I didn't feel safe until I pulled into my own driveway. A few days later, I was sitting at home, trying to shake the whole thing off. I went through my camping gear to clean it. When I opened my cooler, I found something sitting at the bottom that hadn't been there before. A small, round stone. Smooth, dark gray. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then I remembered the pile of rocks back at the camp. The one someone had stacked into that little tower. The stone looked the same. I sat there staring at it for a long time, trying to figure out when it could have gotten there. I always kept my cooler latched. I hadn't opened it since I left the campsite. It must have been put there that morning before I noticed the rocks. I threw it away and put the whole camping set in storage. I haven't gone camping alone since. Sometimes I think about that night by the creek. The footsteps, the stacked rocks, the knock on the window. I tell myself it was just some drifter, someone curious, maybe looking for food or a place to sleep. But I keep wondering how long they'd been out there, watching. Every once in a while, I still wake up at night, thinking I hear footsteps in the yard, slow, steady ones, like leaves crunching under boots. But when I look outside, there's never anyone there. It's been over 10 years now. I don't scare easy anymore, but I still can't stand the sound of rocks tapping together. It was the summer of 2013, and I had driven out to a small campground deep in the woods of northern Arkansas. I was 26 back then, working a warehouse job in Little Rock, and I just needed to get away for a weekend. The plan was simple: 2 nights, 1 tent, a small fire, and silence. I had camped plenty of times before, but always with friends or family. This was my first time alone. I wanted to see what it felt like to just be out there, cut off from everything. The campground was quiet when I arrived. It was Friday afternoon, early August, and the sun was still strong. The air smelled like pine and dirt, and the road leading up was half washed away from rain a few weeks earlier. My spot was at the very end of the lot, tucked between a few tall oaks with a small creek running a few yards behind. The closest other site was maybe 100 yards down the trail. I set up my tent, stacked some firewood, and laid out a folding chair facing the water. Felt peaceful. By sunset, the air had cooled down a little. Crickets started up their noise, and everything began to feel still. I cooked some canned chili over my small stove and watched the last bit of light fade through the trees. When it got dark, it got really dark. I could hear frogs, the faint splash of fish, and the sound of leaves shifting in the wind. It was quiet enough that I could hear my own breathing. Around 9, I noticed a flashlight moving far off through the trees, maybe on the trail that led to the main road. It flickered for a while, then went out. I figured it was just another camper heading to their car or checking the area. I didn't think much of it. I sat out a while longer, staring into the fire until the wood turned to red coals. Then I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and listened to the sounds outside until I drifted off. I woke up sometime after midnight. It wasn't a sudden wake-up, more like that uneasy half-sleep where something feels off. It had started raining lightly, a soft tapping sound on the tent. I lay there for a few seconds, then I heard what sounded like footsteps. They were faint at first, soft, slow crunches on the wet ground. They stopped, then started again. It wasn't an animal. The steps were too deliberate, spaced too evenly. Someone was walking out there. I propped myself up and listened harder. The footsteps moved closer, stopped again. Then I heard the faint swish of clothes brushing against wet grass. My heart started pounding. I told myself maybe it was another camper, maybe someone walking to the creek to pee or something, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had no reason to be that close to my sight. The steps came closer again. I could tell whoever it was right near the fire pit. I hadn't cleaned up much before sleeping, so my camp stove and chair were still sitting out. I could hear something faintly metal, a sound like someone tapping on my mug, then nothing, just the rain and my heartbeat in my ears. After maybe a minute of silence, I unzipped the tent flap just an inch and looked out. My fire pit was just glowing embers now, giving off a faint orange light. That's when I saw her. She was standing just past the ring of light, half hidden behind a tree, maybe 10 yards away. I could only see part of her face and shoulder, but it was enough. She looked like she was in her late 40s or early 50s, thin, wearing a soaked gray jacket and long skirt that clung to her legs from the rain. Her hair was dark and messy, hanging down over her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there, angled slightly toward my tent. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't make a sound. I just stared through that small opening in the zipper. The rain made everything shimmer slightly, and I could hear drops hitting the tarp above me. She didn't have a flashlight, no backpack, nothing. Just her standing there watching. After what felt like forever, she slowly turned her head, looking down toward the creek. Then she stepped back, and the darkness swallowed her up. I kept staring out, waiting to see if she'd come back into view, but she never did. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By sunrise, the rain had stopped. The ground was damp, and the air was cold enough that my breath fogged a little. I stepped out and looked around. There were faint footprints in the mud, small ones, barefoot, I think. They led from the edge of the trees to where my fire pit was, then toward the creek. I followed them for a few yards until they faded into the rocks near the water. I couldn't shake the image of her face. There was something off about it. Not in a supernatural way, just something human but not right. The look in her eyes, blank but focused, like she wasn't really seeing me but knew I was there. I thought about packing up right then, but part of me wanted to believe it was just some local woman wandering through. Maybe she was camping nearby. Maybe she was lost. But there was no tent, no car, no supplies. I walked the trail toward the next campsite down, but it was empty. Same with the one after that. No one had been there in days, no tire marks, no trash, nothing. That second night, I debated leaving, but it was still early in the day and the weather had cleared up. The woods looked normal again, bright and harmless under the sun. I spent most of the afternoon fishing by the creek, trying not to think about the night before. But when the light started to fade, the uneasy feeling came creeping back. As soon as darkness set in, every little noise seemed louder, the pop of a branch, the shuffle of leaves. Around 11, I thought I heard something move across the creek, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. I stayed close to the fire, trying to ignore it. Then, just before midnight, I saw movement again. Across the creek, barely visible through the trees, that same figure stood at the edge of the water. The firelight was weak, but I could make out her silhouette. She was standing still again, facing me. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring across the water, trying to figure out what to do. My car was about a quarter mile down the trail. If I bolted now, she could easily cross the creek and follow me before I reached it. After a few seconds, she stepped forward into the shallow water. The sound of splashing made every muscle in my body lock up. She was crossing. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the creek. The beam caught her halfway across, her clothes clinging to her, her skin pale, her expression flat. That's when I noticed something in her hand. It looked like a long stick or a pole, but I couldn't tell for sure. She kept walking forward, slow and steady. That was enough for me. I grabbed my keys, shoved everything important into my bag, and ran. I didn't even bother putting out the fire. I sprinted down the muddy trail, slipping a few times, my light bouncing off trees. My lungs burned, and every time I looked back, I thought I saw movement behind me. When I finally reached my car, I jumped in and locked the doors. I sat there for a minute, catching my breath, then turned on the headlights. The beam lit up the trail I had just run down, empty. No one was there. I drove out of that campground without looking back. A week later, I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I looked up anything I could find about that area. I found an old news article from 2008 about a missing woman. Her car had been found abandoned near that same stretch of woods. They never found her. I don't know if it was her. I don't know what she wanted, or if she even saw me that night. But I know what I saw wasn't some trick of the dark. That woman was real. And sometimes, when it rains at night and I hear the sound of water tapping on the window, I can still picture her standing there in the trees, half hidden, just watching. I still think about that night sometimes, even years later. It was back in the summer of 2019, when I was 26 and trying to spend more time outdoors. I had been working long hours at a warehouse in Kansas City, and I just wanted to get away for a weekend. No phone, no traffic, no noise. A coworker had mentioned this spot called Black Pine Creek somewhere in southern Missouri. He said it wasn't crowded, barely marked on maps, but had beautiful pine woods and a small stream that ran cold all year. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just that I'd be out camping for the weekend. I packed light tent, sleeping bag, small stove, knife, flashlight, and some food. I drove out early Saturday morning and reached the trailhead just past noon. The trail started off open and easy, but after about 2 miles it got rougher. The trees grew thick, the ground uneven with old roots and rocks covered in moss. I followed the sound of running water until I reached a clearing next to the creek. The ground was mostly flat there, soft from pine needles, and there was enough space to pitch my tent. It was quiet, no signs of people, no trash, no fire rings, just nature. The smell of pine and damp earth was strong. I set up my tent, gathered some dry sticks, and got a small fire going. The creek was about 20 feet away, shallow but steady. The water looked clear, reflecting the sunlight that came through the tall trees. Everything felt peaceful in that kind of lonely way that's hard to describe. Like you're aware of how far you are from everything, and it's both calming and unsettling. As evening came, the woods turned darker faster than I expected. The sky went from orange to gray and then black in what felt like minutes. I made a small dinner on the stove and ate while sitting by the fire. The forest got quiet. The usual sounds, insects, birds, the wind, seemed to fade. That kind of silence doesn't happen in the city. It felt heavy, almost like the trees were pressing in closer. Around 9, I put out the fire and got into my tent. It started to drizzle not long after, soft at first, then heavier. The sound of rain hitting the tent was oddly comforting. I laid in my sleeping bag, listening to it, half awake, half asleep. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking up in complete darkness. No rain sound anymore, just stillness. Took me a second to figure out what woke me. Then I heard it, a faint rustling outside, not like branches swaying or rain dripping, more like footsteps. Slow, careful, uneven steps moving through the wet ground. I froze. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps sounded heavier, more deliberate, like someone trying not to make noise. I laid there, barely breathing. The sound came closer, maybe 10 feet from the tent. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then silence again, just nothing. I waited, probably for minutes, but it felt longer. Then I heard another sound, the faint click of something metal. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, like a piece of gear or a tool being handled. I reached slowly for my flashlight. My hand was shaking. I switched it on, lighting the inside of the tent, and for a second everything looked normal. My bag, my boots, the tent walls. I listened, but whoever or whatever was out there had gone quiet again. I told myself it was probably some hiker passing by, maybe setting up camp nearby. But deep down it didn't feel like that. The night dragged on. I didn't sleep much, just lay there listening to every sound. Around 3 in the morning, I must have dozed off again because I woke suddenly to another noise. A sharp tearing sound, like fabric ripping. came from the side of the tent. I shot upright, flashlight trembling in my hand. There was a small tear near the bottom edge, no bigger than a few inches, and it looked fresh. I stared at it for a long time, trying to think logically. Maybe a branch fell. Maybe a raccoon clawed it. But the tear was clean, straight. Not the kind of rip that comes from something random. I stayed up until dawn, too wired to sleep. The rain had stopped, and when light finally came, I got out to look around. The ground was soft from the rain, perfect for showing footprints. I expected to see animal tracks, but what I saw stopped me cold. There were human footprints, bare feet just a few yards from my tent. They were smudged but clear enough, toes, heel, the full shape. They circled halfway around the tent and then disappeared toward the creek. It made no sense. The ground was cold, the woods muddy. Whoever it was had walked barefoot through all of it. I followed the prints down to the creek, but they stopped right at the edge. I looked across, nothing, just trees and fog on the other side. The weirdest part was that my things were untouched. My pack, stove, food, all there. Nothing stolen. It wasn't like someone came to rob me. It felt more like they were just watching. I decided not to stay another night. I packed up fast, barely ate breakfast, and started hiking back toward the car. The woods looked different in the morning, bright and calm again, almost like the night had been some kind of dream. But the footprints were real. The rip in the tent was real. About a mile into the hike, I found something strange on the side of the trail. A piece of thin twine tied between two trees, chest height, stretched across the path like a trip line. It looked recent. The cord was tight, still dry despite the rain. I stepped over it carefully, not touching it. My stomach sank when I realized it had been placed in a way that someone walking quickly wouldn't notice it until too late. I didn't know what it was meant for. Maybe a trap, maybe just to scare someone. I didn't stop to think too much. I kept walking, faster now, eyes scanning the trees every few steps. The last mile felt endless. I kept hearing faint snaps in the woods, branches breaking, small movements, but I never saw anyone. When I finally reached the parking area, there was only my car there. No other vehicles, no signs of people. Just silence again. I threw my stuff in the back seat and got out of there without even changing out of my wet boots. When I hit cell service about half an hour later, I called my coworker, the one who told me about the place. I didn't tell him everything, just asked if he'd ever actually been to Black Pine Creek. He said no, he'd only heard about it from someone else years ago. I never reported it. I didn't know what to say. Someone barefoot was walking around my tent in the middle of the night? It would have sounded crazy. I told myself it was probably some hermit living in the woods, or maybe another camper who didn't want to be found. But the trip line, that part still gets me. Someone had been out there setting things up. A few weeks later, I checked online forums for hikers and campers in that area. A few people had mentioned weird things near Black Pine Creek. Tents slashed, food taken, sounds at night. One post said they found a pile of small bones tied together with string near the creek. No one ever said they saw anyone. I haven't camped alone since then. Every time I think about going back into the woods, I remember that feeling. Lying in the dark, hearing those slow, deliberate steps moving just outside the thin wall of my tent. I keep wondering what would have happened if I hadn't woken up when I did, or if I'd gone outside to check. It's strange how a quiet place can turn terrifying so fast. I went there looking for peace and ended up realizing how small and vulnerable a person can feel out in the wild, with nothing but fabric between you and whatever's watching from the dark. I went camping alone once, back in the summer of 2019. I was 29 at the time, living in Colorado and trying to get away from city noise, from the routine, from everything that felt repetitive. I wasn't an expert camper, but I had done enough weekend trips with friends to know how to set up a tent and handle myself in the woods. I chose a place near Gunnison National Forest, about 2 hours from where I lived. I had looked it up on some camping forums. People said it was quiet, less crowded, full of creeks and shaded trails. That sounded exactly like what I wanted. I left early in the morning, around 7, with my old gray Ford Ranger loaded with gear, tent, cooler, food, folding chair, flashlight, and a small hatchet. The sky was clear, and the temperature was mild. Felt like a good day to disappear for a while. By the time I reached the gravel road leading toward the forest, my phone had lost signal completely. I didn't mind. I wanted that. I followed the road until I found a small clearing close to a creek that twisted through the trees. The ground was flat and soft, with enough distance from the water to keep dry if it rained. I parked near a slope, set up my tent, and gathered some wood. The air smelled like pine and wet soil. The only sounds were water moving and birds somewhere high in the branches. I spent most of the day walking around, getting familiar with the area. The trail curved around a low hill and connected to another dirt path that seemed unused. I noticed old tire tracks in the mud, maybe from an ATV or a truck, but they looked faded, like they'd been there for weeks. I kept walking until I found a fire pit made from stones. It looked abandoned. Charred wood was still in the center, half buried in ash. It was strange because the pit was far from any campground. No signs, no trail markers, nothing. Just woods. By sunset, I was back at my site, making a small fire and cooking a few hot dogs on a stick. The air cooled quickly. Crickets started their noise, and the woods darkened in that fast, sudden way that always catches you off guard. I ate, cleaned up, and sat by the fire with a beer, staring at the glow and listening to the creek. It was peaceful, too peaceful maybe. There's a kind of silence in remote woods that feels almost heavy. Presses against your ears until you start hearing things that aren't really there. At some point, I thought I heard something in the distance. A branch snapping, maybe. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer. But then I heard another, sharper, closer this time. I looked around, but the firelight only reached a few feet. Beyond that, it was total blackness. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the trees, but saw nothing. Just shapes, trunks, shadows. I shrugged it off and went into my tent. I fell asleep fast, but sometime deep in the night, I woke up. It wasn't to any sound at first. It was more like I felt something, that prickly awareness that someone might be near. I listened carefully. The rainfly moved slightly from the wind. Then I heard its slow footsteps on leaves. Not an animal. Too heavy, too deliberate. I froze. The steps stopped just outside the tent. I didn't move. I just held my breath. I could hear breathing, faint but real, maybe 2 or 3 feet away from where I was lying. It went on for a few seconds. Then I heard the crunch of leaves again, moving away toward the creek. I waited another 10 minutes before I dared to unzip the tent a little and peek out with my flashlight. Nothing. The trees stood still. The creek shimmered faintly in the moonlight. I barely slept after that. I told myself it must have been a hiker who got lost or an animal that just sounded heavier than it was. But something about the breathing stuck with me. It didn't sound confused or curious. It sounded like someone who was just watching. The next morning, the air felt colder. I stepped out and walked around my campsite. That's when I saw the footprints. Not boot prints, but regular shoes. They were faint but clear enough to see the sole pattern, human. The tracks came from the tree line, circled my tent, then went off toward the creek. I followed them slowly until the ground turned rocky and the prints disappeared. I decided to stay alert but not panic. Maybe someone was camping nearby and wandered over by accident in the dark. I spent the day hiking further down the creek, trying to see if there were other campsites. About half a mile downstream, I found something unsettling. There was a small clearing with a half-burnt sleeping bag, an old backpack torn open, and a crushed can of beans. It looked like someone had camped there not long ago. The ground was trampled, and there was a smell. Not rot, but stale, like food that had been left out too long. I didn't touch anything, but the sight made me uneasy. I kept thinking maybe it belonged to whoever walked near my tent last night. That evening, I kept the fire smaller and stayed inside the tent after dark. I tried reading on my flashlight, but I couldn't focus. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not running, just slow, steady steps through the leaves. Then a splash in the creek, like someone wading through shallow water. I turned off my flashlight, heart racing, and waited. The sounds got closer again, and I could tell whoever it was had crossed to my side of the creek. I could hear the soft drag of wet shoes on dirt. Then silence. Pure, total silence. Minutes passed. Then I heard the faint sound of metal, like something being dragged, maybe a chain or a piece of rebar scraping on rock. I wanted to look, but I couldn't move. My body just refused. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I stayed frozen until dawn light seeped through the tent. When I stepped outside, I saw it. Across the creek, near a tree, was a man. He was standing there, facing the water, maybe 30 yards away. He wasn't moving. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, and his hands hung at his sides. His head was slightly tilted down. I called out, but he didn't respond. He just turned, not fast, just enough for me to see his face. His skin looked pale, and his eyes were fixed straight at me. We stood like that for maybe 5 seconds before he walked backward into the woods and vanished. I started packing immediately. I threw everything into the truck, barely folded the tent, and didn't even bother to put the fire out properly. As I was loading my cooler, I noticed something beside the creek. Fresh footprints, leading from my tent to where the man had been standing. I drove off fast, bouncing down the dirt road until I hit pavement again. When I finally reached a gas station about 40 minutes later, I pulled over, shaking. I told the clerk that there was someone weird camping down by the creek, maybe messing with people. He just shrugged and said folks around there sometimes live in the woods, off the grid. I didn't go back to check. I didn't even report it. I just went home and tried to forget it. A week later, I saw something on the local news. A missing man had been found dead near Gunnison National Forest, not far from where I had camped. They said he'd been missing for months, maybe since early spring. His camp had been found first: burnt sleeping bag, old backpack, crushed food cans. I turned off the TV and sat there in silence for a long time. The footprints I saw around my tent, the man standing by the creek, the dragging metal sound. Maybe he wasn't the one watching me that night. Maybe it was someone else, someone who had already made that part of the forest their own. And maybe I was just lucky enough to leave before I became another quiet story buried in the trees. I never thought camping in a graveyard would be a good idea. It wasn't exactly on my bucket list, but here I was, sitting under a pitch-black sky, trying to convince myself that everything would be fine. My buddy, Mark, had come up with the idea, and against my better judgment, I went along with it. We weren't far from the small town of Hartsville, a sleepy place with an old cemetery nestled just on the outskirts. It was a local legend spot, where the graves were said to date back to the 1800s, overrun with moss and ivy. The stones cracked and faded from centuries of weather. We arrived around dusk, the last rays of sunlight barely filtering through the dense tree lines surrounding the graveyard. Mark had brought his tent, a small two-man setup that he insisted we could pitch right in the middle of the graveyard for the full, spooky experience. His logic was that no one would bother us there, and if we were lucky, we might even get some strange occurrences to make the night more exciting. I wasn't so sure. The idea of sleeping between rows of decaying gravestones with the occasional rustling of the wind in the trees was unsettling. But I figured, what the hell, it's just a graveyard. People sleep in worse places, right? We set up the tent just in the middle between a few older graves. The air had that chill that settled in right after sunset, and the quietness was unnerving. No birds, no crickets, just silence. Not the comforting kind either, but the kind that presses on you, making you hyper-aware of your own breath. "Perfect spot," Mark said with a grin, clearly not bothered by the eerie surroundings. He'd been to the graveyard many times before, saying it was peaceful, but I had a feeling he was hiding how truly creepy he found it. "Yeah, sure," I replied, trying to seem calm. "Just a little quiet." He laughed, tossing a bag of marshmallows into the air and catching it like he didn't have a care in the world. I couldn't say the same for myself. I kept looking around, feeling like I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of the tall, twisted shadows of trees looming in the background, their branches looking like reaching arms. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the moon slowly started to rise, casting an eerie silver light across the gravestones. We lit a small campfire in front of the tent to keep the darkness at bay, though the light from the flames barely made a dent in the vast stretch of dark that surrounded us. We sat there, roasting marshmallows and talking about random stuff, trying to ease the tension. But every so often, I'd hear a faint sound. Footsteps? No, it couldn't be. The graveyard was supposed to be deserted. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or my imagination running wild. Then, about an hour into the night, something happened. A sound, a low creaking noise, came from behind me. It sounded like something heavy shifting. I whipped my head around, but the graveyard was as still as ever. "Did you hear that?" I asked Mark, my voice just above a whisper. He looked at me wide-eyed, as if he'd heard it too. "Yeah, maybe just an animal," but we both knew it wasn't. The noise had come from the direction of a particularly old grave, one that had a large stone angel perched above it. The angel's face had long since weathered away, and the wings were chipped and broken. "I'm gonna check it out," I said, standing up and trying to sound braver than I felt. Mark seemed reluctant, but nodded. "Fine, but don't go too far." I grabbed a flashlight, making my way toward the grave that had given me the creeps since we first set up camp. The light from the flashlight flickered as I walked, casting long, unsettling shadows on the gravestones. My heart thudded in my chest as I reached the angel. The air seemed colder here, like a chill had suddenly settled around me. I shone the flashlight at the grave, inspecting it closely. Everything looked normal, just an old headstone covered in moss. But there was something odd about the ground. It was disturbed, the dirt uneven, like something had been recently moved. I knelt down, brushing the dirt aside with my fingers. That's when I saw it. A small, faded name etched into the stone underneath the headstone. * Samuel Green Star. It was almost as if the name was hidden, deliberately covered by the grave. I had never seen that before in any graveyard. I felt uneasy, but the curiosity was stronger. Suddenly, I heard Mark's voice call out to me, "Dude, get back over here. Something's not right." Reluctantly, I stood up and started to walk back to the tent. But as I did, I heard the same creaking sound again, closer this time. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. "Mark," I whispered, but the wind swallowed my voice. Just then, the beam of my flashlight caught something moving in the corner of my eye. A shadow, no, a figure, was standing near the edge of the cemetery, just outside the circle of light from our fire. I squinted, trying to make it out. It was tall, hunched over, and dressed in what looked like old, ragged clothes, but the details were too unclear to make sense of. Panic set in as I started to back up toward the tent. My feet felt like they were dragging through wet sand, and my heart was hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move, but it didn't need to. The longer I looked at it, the more I could feel the weight of its presence, like it was studying me, waiting. I ran. I didn't stop until I was inside the tent, heart racing, gasping for breath. Mark was already sitting up, eyes wide with fear. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice shaky. I nodded, too scared to say anything. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, the fire crackling softly outside. But that silence felt different now, thick, suffocating. Then, from the corner of the tent, I heard a noise, a low scraping sound, like something dragging across the ground. I turned, looking through the thin fabric of the tent wall, my breath caught in my throat. And then, in a split second, the scraping stopped. I jumped up, scrambling to unzip the door, but there was nothing there. Only the quiet, empty graveyard stretching out before me in the moonlight. No sign of the figure. The rest of the night passed slowly, every little noise making us jump. The fire eventually went out, and the cold seemed to seep into everything. But we didn't dare leave the tent. We stayed awake, eyes fixed on the walls, every muscle tense, waiting for whatever was out there to return. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we were ready to leave. We packed up quickly, not speaking much. We didn't need to. The air had changed, and we both knew it. We didn't talk about what happened out there. Not then, not ever, but as I look back now, I know one thing for sure. There was something in that graveyard that night. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. As we drove away, the memory of the shadow lingered, and the quiet of the graveyard stayed with me for a long time. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I was 24 then, fresh out of college, and I'd been working nonstop for months at a job that felt like it was eating away at me. I needed a break, something quiet, something real. I'd been to the outdoors plenty of times with family and friends, but never by myself. I wanted to test myself a little, to see if I could handle the silence and the dark without anyone else around. I picked a place in northern Utah called Miller Creek, a forested area about 2 hours from any major town. It wasn't a well-known spot, but I'd read that a few hunters and hikers went there sometimes. It seemed perfect, remote but not completely isolated. I packed up everything I thought I'd need. A tent, sleeping bag, food, flashlight, knife, lighter, my phone, a small first aid kit, and a few other things. I drove out on a Friday morning, the back of my old Toyota packed to the roof, and by late afternoon I was parked off a dirt trail surrounded by tall pine trees. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. It wasn't completely silent. There was the distant hum of insects and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, but it felt heavy, like the forest itself was listening. I set up camp near a small clearing about half a mile from the creek. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine and damp soil. The sun was still high, so I collected some firewood and sat by my tent for a while, eating a sandwich and just watching the light filter through the trees. As the sun started to drop, the forest changed. The shadows stretched out, and every sound seemed louder. The snapping of twigs, the chirping of crickets, even the soft creak of the trees swaying. I lit a fire before it got too dark, and the flickering light gave the woods an uneasy glow. It was beautiful, but also strange how quickly things felt different once daylight started to fade. That night, after I'd eaten and cleaned up, I sat by the fire for a while and tried to relax. The temperature dropped fast, and the air got cold enough that I could see my breath. I remember staring into the fire, hearing something faint in the distance, a crunching sound, like footsteps, slow and irregular. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the sound didn't fade right away. Stopped, then started again, closer, then stopped completely. I didn't move. I just sat there, my stomach tightening. The fire cracked loudly, and I looked out into the dark tree line, trying to spot movement. Nothing. The woods looked empty, but it felt like something was out there. Eventually, I tossed a few more logs on the fire and forced myself to go to bed. I didn't sleep much. I'd wake up every hour or so, hearing what I thought were footsteps, then silence, then the wind. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. In the morning, everything felt normal again. The sunlight made it almost hard to believe I'd been scared at all. Birds were chirping, the air was warm, and I felt stupid for letting myself get so tense over a few noises. I made some instant coffee, ate breakfast, and decided to go for a short hike toward the creek. The trail was narrow and covered in pine needles. I walked for maybe 15 minutes before I noticed something odd. Along the path, in the dirt, there were footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet. They were small, maybe the size of a kid's, and they went off the path into the woods. I crouched down and touched one. It was faint but recent. The edges hadn't been disturbed by wind or animals yet. I remember standing there for a long time, just staring at them. I hadn't seen or heard anyone since I got there. I told myself again it could have been from a few days ago, maybe from someone swimming in the creek or something. Still, it made me feel uneasy. I turned back and decided to stick around camp for the rest of the day. By late afternoon, clouds started to roll in. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was about to rain. I gathered more wood, built the fire up early, and double-checked that everything in my tent was sealed in case of rain. As night fell, the forest got dark faster than before. The firelight seemed weaker, like it barely pushed back the dark. Around 9, it started again, the crunching sound. It wasn't constant, but it was close. I froze. It came from the direction of the creek. Slow steps, a pause, another step. My heart was hammering. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound, but the light only reached so far. Just trees, nothing else. Then I saw movement. Not fast, just a quick shift between two trees, like someone stepping out of view. I aimed the light, but there was nothing there. The sound stopped again. I didn't move for what felt like minutes. The fire popped, sending a spark into the dirt, and I jumped at the sound. That was enough. I went into my tent, zipped it up, and sat there with my flashlight on. I could hear my own breathing. The sound didn't come back for a while, and I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it again. But around midnight, I heard something else. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing, faint but right outside the tent. I held my breath and listened. It was low, slow, like someone standing inches from the fabric. The hairs on my neck stood up. I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping the flashlight, trying not to make a sound. The breathing lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. Then, a light tap, like a finger brushing against the tent wall near my feet. I jerked back and kicked at it instinctively. Silence. I waited another few minutes before unzipping the tent just enough to look out. The fire had burned low. The clearing looked empty. I didn't see or hear anything, but I knew I wasn't sleeping after that. I threw a few more logs on the fire and sat up until the sky started to lighten. When morning finally came, I checked around the tent. In the dirt near the back, there were prints again, bare feet, small, leading toward the trees. But this time, there were more of them, maybe 3 different sets. My stomach dropped. I looked around the area, scanning for anyone, but it was just me. I packed everything up as fast as I could. On my way out, I saw something that made me stop again. About 20 feet off the trail, hanging from a low branch, was a piece of fabric, gray, torn, dirty. It looked like part of a shirt or maybe a blanket. Beneath it, the ground was flattened, like someone had been sleeping there recently. I didn't go closer. I didn't want to know more. When I finally got back to my truck, I threw my gear in and left without even looking back. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, and even then, I kept checking my mirrors. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about those prints. I tried to reason it out. Maybe it was just some local kids messing around, or some campers who'd wandered through barefoot. But the prints were too close, too quiet, too deliberate. Whoever it was, they'd come right up to my tent in the middle of the night. It's been years since that trip, and I haven't gone camping alone again. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed late at night, I still think about that sound, the slow breathing right outside the tent, and I can feel that same heavy silence from the woods pressing against me. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know this much: it wasn't an animal. Someone had been watching me, moving closer each night, and if I'd stayed one more, I'm not sure I'd have made it out. I remember that trip too clearly. It was the summer of 2017, and I was 26 then. I had driven out alone to Pine Hollow, a thick patch of forest in western Oregon that stretched for miles without much sign of people. I wanted quiet, to get away from work and the noise of everything. I'd done a few solo camping trips before, but this one stuck with me. Maybe because of the storm, maybe because of what happened that night. I arrived late in the afternoon, just before the rain started. The air was damp, heavy with that smell that comes right before a storm. I parked my truck off a dirt road that cut through the trees, grabbed my backpack and gear, and walked about half a mile in before finding a clearing big enough for a tent. The grass there was flattened and muddy in spots, maybe from deer or someone else who'd camped before. It felt isolated, quiet enough that all I could hear were the distant croaks of frogs and the slow creaking of trees swaying in the wind. Setting up the tent took longer than usual because the air was thick and the ground soft. My hands were slick with sweat by the time I got the stakes in. The sky turned gray so fast it felt like someone dimmed a light. I gathered some dry wood under the tarp I brought and managed to get a small fire going before the drizzle started. First, the rain was gentle. It hit the leaves in soft patterns, that calming rhythm that makes you think everything's peaceful. I sat near the fire, eating from a can of chili, watching steam rise from the metal lid every time a drop of rain landed on it. My jacket was waterproof, but I could feel the humidity crawling through it anyway. The temperature dropped as the sun went down, and fog began to crawl through the trees like smoke. I could barely see more than 10 feet in front of me without my flashlight. When I looked past the firelight, everything turned into shifting black shapes. The forest felt endless. I remember staring out into it and thinking how easy it would be to get lost if I stepped just a little too far from the camp. The rain picked up hard after dark, thick, cold drops that hit the tent like gravel. The fire hissed and shrank until it was just a red glow. I got inside my tent, zipped it shut, and tried to settle into my sleeping bag. The sound of the rain was constant, so loud that it drowned out every other sound. The wind, the crickets, everything. I lay there, half awake, listening to it hammer against the fabric. It must have been around midnight when I heard something else. It was faint at first, like a branch snapping, then another, not close but not far either. I froze, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer moving through the wet brush. But after a few seconds, there was another sound, something slower, heavier, like footsteps, not quick ones, careful ones. The rain made it hard to tell exactly where it was coming from. Every drop blended into the noise, but beneath it, I could make out a rhythm: crunch, pause, crunch, pause. My heart started racing. I kept telling myself it could have been a bear, or even just rainwater dripping through the branches. But I couldn't shake how deliberate it sounded. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on. The light cut through the tent's fabric in a soft glow. I didn't unzip it. I just stayed still, listening. The sound stopped. Everything went quiet except the rain. I lay back down slowly, pretending I wasn't shaken, but I couldn't close my eyes after that. Maybe 20 minutes later, I heard it again. This time closer. Crunch, crunch. Then a pause. It sounded like someone circling the tent. I could almost feel the ground vibrate under each step. I held my breath. I wanted to grab the knife I kept in my pack, but it was at my feet and moving even a little made the tent creak. I didn't move. Then I saw something, just a faint shape through the thin tent wall. A shadow passed across the fabric, breaking the pattern of rainwater running down. It stopped right beside where I was lying. I could see the outline of what looked like a leg, a human leg. The shape stayed there for several seconds. I didn't move. My pulse was so loud I thought whoever it was would hear it. Then the shadow moved again, slow, like whoever was out there was crouching down. The outline shifted, and I saw what looked like a head leaning closer to the tent. I could hear faint breathing now, soft but uneven, almost like whoever it was trying not to make noise. I didn't understand what they were doing. After a long moment, I heard the sound of wet footsteps walking away. They didn't go far, maybe 20-30 feet, and then stopped. I waited. Nothing. Just rain again. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. Eventually, exhaustion hit, and I must have drifted off in short bursts, waking up every time the wind pushed against the tent. At first light, I unzipped the tent slowly and looked out. The rain had eased to a light drizzle. Everything was soaked. My fire pit was flooded. I stepped outside, boots sinking into the mud. The forest looked normal, quiet and still, but I noticed right away that the ground around my tent was covered in fresh footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet. They were deep too, like the person was heavy or had been standing in one spot for a while. The prints led from the trees to my tent and back again, looping around it a few times. I followed them a little way toward the tree line before they vanished into the wet leaves. The cold ran through me when I realized how close they'd been. Whoever it was had been there long enough to walk circles around where I slept. I packed up fast, barely eating, hands shaking as I stuffed everything back into the truck. The road out of Pine Hollow was slick and full of puddles, and I almost slid off it twice. The whole time I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking along the road behind me. When I finally hit the main highway, I stopped at a gas station. The woman at the counter said the storm had knocked out power across half the county. I nodded, pretending to listen, but my mind was still in those woods. I didn't tell her anything. What could I say? That someone barefoot had stalked my tent in the rain and just left. That night, when I got home, I dumped my gear in the garage and noticed something that made my stomach twist. On the side of the tent, near where my head had been, the thin fabric had a small tear, like it had been poked from the outside. The edges were stretched and frayed, just enough to make me think someone had touched it. I threw the tent out the next morning. I've gone camping again since then, but never alone, and never in Pine Hollow. Every time it rains at night, even when I'm home in bed, that sound, the soft, slow crunch of footsteps in wet dirt, finds its way back into my head. I still don't know who was out there that night or what they wanted, but I do know this: it wasn't an animal. Someone was watching me, and for some reason they decided to walk away. It was late October of 2018 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in northern New Mexico. I'd been working long hours at a warehouse job, and I just needed a few days away from people, phones, and noise. I found a small spot near the Carson National Forest, not far from a dirt road but hidden enough that no one would see me from the trail. I drove out in my old Chevy pickup with a tent, a small cooler, and a rifle I kept in the truck bed. The air was dry, cool, and the smell of pine stuck to everything. By the time I got there, It was late afternoon. The sun was dropping behind the mountains, turning the sky a deep orange mixed with gray. I set up my tent near a small clearing where the grass had gone yellow and dry. There was a small creek a few hundred feet away, barely running, but enough for washing up. Everything was quiet except for the wind and the occasional crack of branches falling somewhere deeper in the woods. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. After dark, I sat by a small fire I made out of dry wood I'd gathered earlier. I didn't bother eating much, just a few bites of jerky and a beer. The stars were clear, brighter than anything I'd seen back home. I remember staring at the dark tree-line across from me. The way it looked like a solid wall, hiding everything beyond it. The longer I looked, the more it felt like something was behind those trees, watching me. I tried to brush it off as paranoia. You always feel watched in the woods when you're alone. I put more wood on the fire and stayed close to the light. Around midnight, I heard something move out there. It wasn't a small sound either, it was heavy, deliberate, like someone walking through leaves but slower, cautious. My first thought was a deer or maybe an elk, but then it stopped. Complete silence. No wind, no insects. I could almost feel my heartbeat echoing in my chest. I turned off my flashlight, crouched, and listened. Nothing. A few minutes passed before the sound came again, closer this time. A soft crunch of dry leaves, then another and another. It was pacing the edge of the tree-line. I reached for the rifle leaning against a log beside me and held it, not pointing it yet. I waited. The sound stopped again, like whoever or whatever was out there knew I was paying attention. I stayed that way for maybe half an hour until my nerves started to calm down. I figured it had to be an animal. Coyotes roamed that area, and they made strange noises sometimes. I decided to crawl into the tent and get some sleep, though I left the rifle right next to the flap. I woke up sometime around 3 a.m. to the faint sound of breathing. At first, I thought it was me, but it wasn't. It was coming from outside the tent, just a few feet away. Slow, shaky breathing, like someone struggling to control it. I didn't move. I could hear the fabric of the tent shift slightly from the faint movement of air. I thought maybe it was a bear smelling around, but then I heard a sound that froze me solid. It was a voice, a broken human voice trying to sound normal but just slightly off. It wasn't clear words, more like soft, uneven sounds trying to form speech. But I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. After a few seconds, I heard slow footsteps moving around the tent. The breathing followed the steps. I kept my hand on the rifle, afraid that any sudden movement would make noise. The steps stopped again, right behind my head. I could feel something standing there, and for a moment, I thought I saw a faint shadow fall across the tent wall. Tall, with arms hanging low, like its shoulders were too wide for its frame. It stood there for what felt like forever. Then, without warning, it made a sound that didn't fit any animal I knew. A dry, broken mimic of a human groan, mixed with a rasping growl. My whole body went cold. I didn't move until the first light of dawn started showing through the tent. When I finally looked outside, nothing was there. No footprints, no sign of anything, just the quiet woods and my dying fire pit. I packed my stuff quickly. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to leave. But before leaving, I noticed something strange near the tree-line. There were tracks, not boot prints, not paws, but something in between. The front part looked like a human foot, but too long, and the heel seemed almost clawed. The prints were deep, like whatever it was had some weight to it. I tried to tell myself maybe it was an animal with a deformity or overlapping tracks. I wanted to believe that. The drive back down that dirt road felt longer than it should have. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see something in the tree line beside the road. When I got back to pavement, I finally started to relax a little. But the weird part was when I stopped at a small gas station in Taos to grab a drink. There was an older guy behind the counter, probably in his 60s, And when I told him I'd been camping near Carson, he just stared at me for a moment. He didn't say anything, but his expression changed in a way I didn't like. Not surprise, more like he wanted to tell me something but thought better of it. That night, I stayed at a cheap motel on the way home. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, following me. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again, this time in the motel bed. There was no sound at first, just that heavy, quiet air. Then I heard a single noise from outside the window, a short, breathy grunt, the same kind I heard near my tent. I didn't look, couldn't. I just turned off the lamp and waited until sunrise. When I looked outside, there were no footprints, but the dust on the truck bed looked like something had brushed across it, like a hand dragging along the side. When I got home, I told myself to forget it. I went back to work, tried to focus on normal things. But sometimes at night, when everything's quiet, I still remember the way that breathing sounded. Forced, uneven, human but not human. I started reading about strange reports in that area, and a few old posts mentioned people hearing things that mimic voices, things that move like animals but stand like people. They called them skinwalkers, though most folks just said that to make sense of something they couldn't explain. I don't claim to know what I heard or saw. All I know is that it wasn't an ordinary person or animal. It was something that knew how to move quietly, how to watch without being seen, how to make you question your own senses. Something that stayed just far enough away to never prove it was real. It's been years now, but I still haven't gone camping again. I sold my tent, the rifle, even the truck. I can't stand the sound of dry leaves crunching at night or the sight of tree leaves fading into the dark. Sometimes I'll be sitting on my porch late, and if the wind hits just right, I swear I can smell that same cold pine air, the one that hung over that clearing in New Mexico. It always makes me wonder if that thing, whatever it was, ever stopped watching me. Maybe it never did.